Welcome to today's seminar for the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences. Before we introduce today's speaker, are there any announcements, exciting news that everybody would like to make their group aware of? All right. I sent out an email about. Okay, thank you, Pinky. I sent out an email about a recent paper published by one of our graduate students, Kevin Oluwach. So be sure to check that out. Really exciting paper on kind of the overlaps between socioeconomic, agronomic, and climatic factors in determining maize yields in Kenya. So have a read. Any other announcements before we have our diversity share? All right. Pinky, you had a diversity share?
Yes, I just plugged the link in the chat. If you can just read that would be great. Thanks, Kyle. I just couldn't find the link to the paper, sorry. But it's about, how a recent study found racial bias in NSF funding. And it's particularly important because, in many institutes, there's so much focus on, certain metrics, individual metrics, also grant funding. And it's important to remember that, there are studies that are showing that there are racial biases. So I just wanted to point that out.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Pinky. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Deepak Ray. So yeah, I'm really delighted that he's here with us today. He's senior scientist in global landscapes at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. He conducts field-leading research on local to global scale food security, and his work has really inspired a new wave of investigation to mapping our world's food systems, and it's certainly had certainly served as a great personal inspiration to the research that I do. So I'm really excited that he's here today. So among the questions that he's interested in exploring are, does the productivity growth in crops track rising food demands, and how has climate change already impacted crop yields? And so to answer these questions, he works with international collaborators around the world to use high-resolution global crop statistics that he spends a lot of time and effort developing and gathering himself. So his analysis helps a lot with NGOs, industries, international organizations, and governments to make more informed policies and take decisions to capitalize on positives and explore ways to overcome challenges faced in the agriculture and food security sectors. And his work has had a real and important positive impact in this regard. So his overall goal is to explore through the agricultural lens ways towards a future which benefits both people and planet, and that has really important and deep implications for this semester's theme of sustainable development. So we're certainly really lucky to have him here with us today. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Deepak Ray as today's seminar speaker. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks for the introduction. The issue of my work will influence governments and policies is more aspirational than it actually has happened, I think. So I continue to aspire and try to work towards that direction. I also would like to apologize that I completely forgot that I have to give a talk and I did not wear my professional dress. So I'm just dressed like another graduate student. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen now and we will get going. So everybody can see this correct? Well,
Yes, we can see it.
great. All right. So many of you, I'm sure, know that we need to increase the calorie production around the world. And over time, different people have come up with different numbers. David Tillman in his 2011 paper calculating like how much extra calories we would require for the global population in 2050, estimated almost like a doubling requirement from like 2000 levels. Whereas the World Resources Institute around 2019 told there should be like a 56% increase in global agricultural calorie production. And more recently, they have estimated that from 2017, it should be like 47%. So one of the reasons why we need to increase crop production, everybody is aware, we recently hit the 8 billion mark, like this week itself. So world population like 100 years ago was very little, like 1 or 2 billion humans, and now we are at 8 billion. And it is continuing to increase every single year. In fact, when I started to give this kind of presentation and this research in the global, at the global scale, we were talking about the world population is going to become 9.1 billion by 2050. And then after some years, it became 9.3 billion by 2050, then 9.7 or so, which is what we are targeting now, maybe 10 billion. And it doesn't even stabilize. So in like the early 2010s, we're talking about the world population stabilizing by 2050. Now it is not even going to stabilize by 2050, just keep going incrementally up to the end of the century and reach somewhere maybe 11 billion humans. So we need to increase more calorie production because of this global population growth. But there's a bigger reason why we need to increase more calorie production, because it has been shown historically, like as income increases, the demand for calories and protein per capita also increases. So lest you think that this is not happening or did not happen, here is like what happened to egg consumption and poultry consumption. How many kilograms of meat per capita in India? Essentially zero, or very close to zero, in the 1960s, more than 50 years ago, per capita. And since then, the population of India has increased tremendously in the last 50 years. But the rate, the per capita consumption of poultry itself has also increased from like 200 grams to now like 2 kilograms. So 10 times increase per capita increase in chicken. Basically, this is chicken consumption in India. This is nothing compared to what has happened in China. Absolutely nothing. In China, which also has seen a huge population increase in the last 50 years, the per capita consumption has also gone up, like from very small numbers to more than 16 kilograms or so per capita every year. And then if you think this is extreme, think the United States just dwarfs China also, except for the eggs. The Chinese already consume as many eggs as the Americans do per capita per person. And the United States population is also projected to keep growing and become like 500 million by 2050. So what is happening around the world is essentially this. The Indians are looking at the Chinese and say, they eat way more chicken. We need to increase our chicken consumption per capita. And the Chinese are looking at the Americans and saying that, oh, we need to increase more, we need to have more chicken per capita every year. And everybody is looking to the Americans and the European diet and saying like, we need to have more meat and dairy consumption around the world. And this thing should be, this is probably replicating the same thing or tracking the same kind of increase for beef and for hog, pork consumption and for dairy consumption. So this kind of huge growth requires not the farming of like your backyard chicken farming or like hobby farmers or like me going on a tractor and farming like 1 acre and able to feed the world. This is not going to work like that. This kinds of huge increases in demand requires industrial scales of farming, industrial scales of crop production, industrial scales of animal production. And then when you look all around the world, you essentially see a map, which is in this map showing like all the green colors where you already have all the croplands and all the brown areas where you have less capacity to grow crops. And it is all pasture. The color scheme in this particular map is like you see on the upper left side. It depends upon like how much pasture is versus how much crop. So a grid cell could have some crops, some pastures, but the dominant color is speaking out to us. And it shows that all across the world, we use land where we could do some kind of farming. We already farm. And the remaining areas are like the equatorial part of Africa, where there's this equatorial forests. And you have the Brazilian Amazon, the Indonesia, the Borneo Island of forests, which you can cut down, which is happening to some extent to grow, to have agriculture. And the other areas are like the desert where you essentially cannot do any agriculture. And also the very, permafrost region and the cold areas, the Arctic areas, where you also cannot do agriculture for now. Climate change may make it possible in the future. So roughly 38% of all the world's ice-free surface is already under agriculture. It's like close to I think I forgot the number exactly, 1.53 billion hectares is on the cropland, and 2 billion hectares is on the pastures, totaling up to more than 3 billion. I'm just trying to recall from our nature paper. So the point is our agricultural land where we could do agriculture, we already do agriculture. So what is the solution then? If you already do agriculture everywhere, do you want to cut down all the remaining natural landscape, like the Cerrado already converted into soybean, and then the expansion of soybean agriculture or maize agriculture into the Amazon? So I think the solution is probably to increase your crop productivity. I think almost everybody agrees on this aspect, that we need to increase our crop productivity. So what I did, and this, to answer the question, how we are doing worldwide. So this like way back, like the early 2010s, there was this big debate going around in the scientific community between agroecologists on one side and the seed companies on the other side. And the seed companies folks were looking at their field trials and saying that we have invented, or we have, gene edited or GMO seed, developed such seed that our yields are just going to go up. There is not going to be a problem of food security around the world. Agroecologists were looking at the farmer level data and what they were getting from different parts of the world. And they were seeing like the yields were stagnating and had been stagnating for some time in different parts of the world. So now these people got at loggerheads. They're saying like, no, there's no problem. There is a problem. There's no problem. There is a problem. And there was no way to solve the debate. So what was required is to do a global analysis to see how we were doing all across the world in terms of yield. And so I spent quite some time to build a data set and then doing a yield analysis all across the world. So if somebody asks me, at least, which is the most important crop you think from the perspective of food security, I think I'm going to say it is going to be rice all across the world. Even though we don't use so much rice, we don't consume so much rice in Europe or maybe in North America, but for food security perspective, it's rice. And then when you see all across the world, you see these two dominant colors. One is the green, which basically means it's like this color scheme is like a stoplight. So green means the yields were increasing, appears to be increasing. And the orange one is like a stoplight. It has stagnated. So in large parts of India and even larger parts in China, the yields of rice have stagnated. So there are the top three countries of the world for rice production are China, India, and then Indonesia. And in China, Indonesia, vast area of rice yields have stagnated. And globally, if you see the number, 40% of the rice growing areas of the world have stagnated. And I have done a more recent analysis, and I'm not showing that figure. It is still it's still holding at that same level of 40% of rice yield stagnation all across the world. So if somebody asks you, or asks me at least, which is the second most important crop in terms of food security, I'll say it is wheat. And both these crops together are approximately 50% of all the calories that we consume directly from these crops. So they're very important for food security around the world. And you see a lot of this orange. So globally speaking, 40% of the wheat harvested areas of the world are not seeing any more of the yield increases. But the problem is particularly acute in like European countries, Western Europe. In India, around 80% of the wheat growing areas are not seeing any more yield increases. And, and in China also, a lot of areas not seeing yield increases. In the United States, if you look at this figure, you see the southern Great Plains states like Kansas, Oklahoma, having this stagnation in wheat yields. But further north in North Dakota, South Dakota, etc., the yields are still going up. Now, if somebody asks you which is the third most important crop in the world, I would say it is corn or maize, as it is known in the rest of the world. And the problem is less acute. I'll draw your attention to two parts of the world for in this map. One is sub-Saharan Africa, which is dominated by this orange colors and also the red colors. The red color means like the yields went up and then went like 1960s, and then went up and then came down all the way to like what it was right in the beginning. So kind of a yield collapse. So there was a plateauing at certain point and then it came down. So Zimbabwe was probably connected just political reasons. Robert Mugabe's land distribution policy and all the best farmers probably abandoned their land. But in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it is yields are stagnant. But if you look in the Midwest, Minnesota, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, other places, it is all green color. So the yields are increasing in most of the United States, but in sub-Saharan Africa, the yields are stagnant. And I would like to tell you to just remember these 2 points for the remainder, for some more points I would like to make later on in this talk. So Midwest doing very well, still increasing yields. Sub-Saharan Africa yields are all stagnant. They are not improving any further. So moving on to the one more map like this kind of a map. Soybean, if somebody asks you the fourth most important crop in the world for food security, I'll say it's soybean. And again, in the Midwest, mostly like seeing good increases in soybean yields. So, okay, I will now, what I'll do, because this is a spatial or geography department, so I will now just take a detour, okay, for a few minutes. And I showed you lots of maps, which shows like this something is happening here versus there. So I just want to spend a few minutes explaining like how I build these maps, the raw data collection behind it. So many of you may know that the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization provides crop statistics. So for example, how much is maize yields are in the United States? How much is maize harvested in the United States? And how much is the production of maize in the United States, and so on for all the countries of the world. These are all individual single points, and over time you can track it. So we can know in the US, whatever yield was every single year, and we can track it over time. But the United States is a huge country. For comparison, think about like Russian Federation or China, huge countries, India, huge countries. So a single point is really not able to capture it. But the advantage of this UN FAO data is it is freely available. Everybody can go there. And with a little bit of practice, even a grad student within 1 week, I can guarantee they will be able to download the data and start playing with it. And you have, and everybody will download the same data. So data is similar. Everybody can get the same data. And you can work on your method and answer different questions, but you don't really understand what's going on in the United States. So like Minnesota is different from Kansas, and Kansas is different from California. So, I mean, how do you look at the differences then? If you have a single point, it's kind of difficult to do it. Folks have done it and written very good publications with just national level analysis, but I try to do it a little bit better. So one can start to analyze at the state level. So we have like whatever, 55 states or something. Sorry, I forgot the number of states. I'm going to get kicked out of the US very soon for not remembering how many states are in the United States. But some 50 odd states or something like that is there in the the continental United States. So you can study that, but then you have to do the collection yourself for every single country. So if you want to study it globally, you have to go from China to United States, every single country one by one, and start collecting the data for every state, for every crop, and for every year. And there are like 3,500 times every time you have to do that study. So it becomes really hard very rapidly from like easily available data to just to get a better spatial analysis. It's like 2 years of your life of slogging through data collection or something of that nature will take place. But I will argue like some of the states of the United States, like Minnesota, is bigger than many of the Central American countries. So northern part of Minnesota is mostly just forests, and all the agriculture is further south. Iowa is just forest. Again, in the Northeast, there are states, there is some agriculture, but the rest of them are just forest. I mean, what can you understand by looking at just the state level data, one single point per state? You cannot really distinguish between what is happening in this part versus that part. Like Colorado, half of the western part is mountain, the eastern part is like all these shallow, plains. So we should do it better, is my statement. And then you can look at like the 46,000 or so counties of the world. And then of course, your life is extremely hard already because of this ambition that you want to solve every single county of the world. So it's very, very hard to do that. And I will tell you that I have not succeeded actually in tracking 46,000 jurisdictions around the world. I managed to do something like 19,000 or so, or 20,000 jurisdictions of the world, and it has taken a long time to improve that. Many folks have done the analysis, individual countries very well, but then they don't have any understanding of what the rest of the world. I think the global food system is so well, it's connected. And if you look at it from the climate perspective, it is like, it's a global thing. It's not the effect here or there. You need to study the whole system. And just for context, you have astrophysicists who study galaxies. We are only trying to attempt one single small Earth. So I'm sure people can try to do that. Just a little bit of hard work. So if you try to study 150 major crops globally, and you study it for 50 years, you'll have to collect some 750 million data points. It's very, very hard to do that, given the problem that sometimes the data is not even available. So that was my little detour, okay, of how I collected some of the data, not entirely happy with it, still struggle every day to collect some of the data, and it continues. And I hope grad students get excited and others, colleagues get excited and also join in the effort. So I will now come back to the question. I told you to remember, like in the US Midwest, the corn yields were green, increasing, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, they had all stagnated. And that, and also the anecdotal knowledge that why we harvest our corn over here in the US made me think, like, why do we actually harvest crops all across the world? So I will now devote the whatever little amount of time I have to just talk about that, like the next 10, 15 minutes. So why do we really harvest crops all across the world? Now, as opposed to the simplistic thinking that we harvest crops because it is our food, that was of our parents' time, maybe. We were harvesting crops because it was for food. But this is like, okay, this graph shows like why we harvested maize in the United States over time using the UN's food balance sheets. So first of all is that blue line. So from 1964 to 2013, you see there is up and down of the blue line, which is the fraction of the total maize going into animal feed. It has gone down slowly and gradually. But what has picked up is this red line. And this red line is the diversion of corn for industrial purposes, for ethanol production. And it has become even more. More of the corn gets proportion of the corn is now diverted for ethanol production compared to animal feed. Then there is the brown line, which is like around 20% of the corn is harvested and then shipped on. And another 10% or so is used for processing. That means it's processed into maybe high fructose corn syrup, or it's processed into some other products. The amount of corn used as food is negligible. It's essentially zero. So this is why we harvest corn in the United States. For animal feed, but more and more increasingly so for industrial use, ethanol production, and maybe other industrial uses also. But when you look at which crop is this? I think this is soybean, right? So for soybean, it is essentially for processing use and for exports. So the processing part is like the soybean that we harvest is industrially split and processed into different things. So the protein is taken out, the oil is taken out, and you have different products out of that. So that is the processing use. And then you have the export of the soybean. So soybean use is very different from maize use. And wheat use is again very different from these two crops. And the top three crops of the United States are essentially just these three crops: corn, soybean, and wheat. So the wheat, more half is exported. The other 40% or so is used as food. And then some big chunk, but smaller one, is used as animal feed. So these are the uses of crops in the United States. And there are other crops also. You have some other rice harvest and et cetera, et cetera. And suppose you did that for every single crop, for every single country, and then did a trend analysis of it. This is what you see. So sorry, I have made a massive jump. I just like jumped across the Atlantic Ocean without explaining any further. But you saw like some back-end calculation of like how crops are used. And then here is a line chart, line graph showing like, what is the trend then? Why do we harvest crops and where we are going? So the largest chunk of land being used to harvest crops goes for food. It's true. It's for direct food consumption. So like wheat harvest and then making a flour out of it, and then you make a whatever, you eat that flour in different ways. And you can do the same with rice. You harvest the rice, send it to the rice mill, and then you polish it and take all its nutrients off. So you're left with just the carbohydrate, and it's very nice and shiny and white. You eat that and get diabetes by eating too much of it. But nevertheless, that is like the food use of crops. And it is the way the trend is at the global scale. By 2030 also, it will remain essentially the same. Feed use also of crops going to essentially remain the same. The three sectors, which is really ramping up for, and why we harvest crops for, is one, harvesting crops for export. Number two, harvesting crops for processing. And the one which is really coming up very rapidly is harvesting crops for their industrial usage. Now, when you look at the productivity of these sectors, like how many calories is harvested per hectare, but meant for that initial use, you see that when you harvest crops for the industrial use, they are the most productive crops. And if you had harvested crops for food use, it is the least productive. How much less productive? Industrial crop is more than twice as productive as a food use crop. And of course, being dragged by, and that's being stretched across, because there's the industrial use of crops like corn in the United States, very highly productive, ramping up every single year. And there's the other use of the crop, which is for the food use in sub-Saharan Africa, all stagnant, still at 1 tons per hectare in most of the countries. Whereas in Iowa, it has already reached like close to 10 tons per hectare, 10 times more productive and still rising. So that is why I think that this speed is getting much more faster, and it is possible that by 2030, it will be more than twice. It's already twice as more productive compared to industrial use of crops compared to food use crops. It will be even more than twice by that time because of its very fast rate of increase in productivity. But if you look at the yield from another perspective, like say proteins, Then you see the processing use is a little bit higher, but the industrial use is catching up. Again, food is right at the rock bottom productivity in terms of like how many proteins you harvested per hectare. So it is increasing at 1.8 times for processing use, and it is already more than twice as productive when you harvest crops for processing. And then if you look at it in terms of like kilograms of fat per hectare harvested, you see the processing and exports are really catching up. And one can think about it, why fat is, the export part is so high. It is because you're exporting all this palm oil and other crops from Indonesia. It's just basically packed and densely packed with calories. So that's kind of pushing that one further. And the amount of fat in food crops, productivity, it's at the rock bottom and very gradual increase. So don't expect too much fat coming out from crops which are harvested for food. And so processing is like almost 4 to 5 times higher in terms of productivity compared to when you harvest crops all across the world in terms of like the for food use. So this was like a global summary. And so this is like how the world is moving between 2010 and 2030. That is from column, that 2010 column to 2030 column. Every single use of crops increases, but the greater portion of the increase in calories harvested goes to industrial. So when folks say like, oh, world food security is, not, we harvest lots of calories. No, we harvest lots of calories. We'll harvest even more calories, but where will it go? It is going away to first to industrial use. Then you're exporting it, and who buys the exports? Those countries which have the money. It goes away in processing. That means it's processed into some animal meal, and then it is converted into, say, beef. You know, the efficiency of beef conversion from calories. So 100 calories the cow eats, you get only 5 calories back in terms of calories. But, you get lots of protein and other things. So I have nothing against that. But that's how, from the calorie efficiency point of view, most of it is lost. So we will keep increasing, but greater and greater portion is going where? It's not going for growing, harvesting more and more food. And it has implications then. So coming back to why do we harvest a crop? So this is why we were harvesting crops in 1964, in the 1960s. The world, most of the world was green in color, which meant in this map, green means crops being harvested for food use, direct food use, rice meal, and then you eat it, or wheat harvested, and then you get the flour and you have made, or maize, and then maize flour and make it into a tortilla and you eat it. So that's like the food use of the of a crop. But then in Europe, you see all this blue color. So you were diverting at that time also a lot of your crop for animal feed. And in United States, you had this mixture of animal feed and processing going on already in the 1960s. So, in the 1960s, the way we used to do the animal feed versus processing part. So we had all the grain, and then you made all the flour, but then there was some excess. Instead of throwing that excess into the Mississippi River, people were smart. They began to feed it to the animals. So that is how animal feed began. And then fast forward 50 years, now it has become an art in itself. Now it is industrial scale production of processing and industrial use. So Brazil has small animal meal processing plants. United States has massive animal feed processing plants, all computerized and everything. And just like you have your pet food, you have the chicken meals and hog meals and etc., just customized to every stage of the animal's life stage. So it's very customized and perfect for the feed. So it's optimized, all industrial scale farming, responding to what is happening actually around the world, which is the starting point of my talk. So most of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is still green in color. They're still harvesting their crops for use as food. But in many other places like China, there's already been a shift. Many parts of upper, more northern parts of China, from the Yellow River and curving down to the South China Sea. You have this use of crops for animal feed and for processing. And in India also, which is supposedly the vegetarian country or something. Then you have this entire belt from north to south in central part of India, where all the calories is being diverted for processing, processing into many things. So that is how the world is going as we saw it. And if we projected it forward, this is what the world would have looked like, will look like. And I think we are correct. When we published our paper, the Russian Federation-Ukraine war had not yet started, and the world had not received its recent agricultural shock of the embargo in the grain exports. But you see the Russian Federation and Ukraine, our projections were by 2030, they were all going to be like in this brown or reddish brown kind of colors. Brown means lands which were being used to harvest crops for export. Just like Malaysia is like brown in color in parts of Indonesia or some Australia, some shades of brown. So you're harvesting crops so that you export them. So they were already on a trajectory of that. And the entire world is in this trajectory. So United States will move more and more towards the industrial use and for processing use of crops. Mexico will use more and more of their harvest for animal feed and so on and so forth. So only 29% of the harvested land by 2030 is probably going to be used for direct food consumption, direct food harvest, crops for direct food harvest. 8% would be for industrial use, and there's the entire list for that. So this has an implication to the UN's Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which is food security all. And it is tied very closely, hand in hand with the food security UN SDG goal number 1, which is poverty reduction. And the second goal, which is the food security for all, because poverty and food security kind of go hand in hand. So food security has at least 4 pillars. The first is the production part. You need to harvest enough crops. You need to have enough food in your stores. The second is you need to have the capacity to go to the store and acquire the food. Third is you need to be able to utilize the food. So for example, you buy, say, rice, but you don't have any way to boil the water. So how the hell will you eat the rice? You cannot eat the rice. So and you need to be able to utilize it within your family equitably and all these things. And then there has to be a stability. You just cannot go to the store and get, or a farmer cannot harvest the crop, a potato crop or some other crop for one season, and the other 2-3 seasons, they're just hungry. So you cannot have that. You need to have stability. There's some other new things which have come up for food security, which is one is agency and one is the sustainability in the long term. Agency means like people who like to eat rice should not be told to eat wheat. And those who like to eat wheat should get the access to the bread and not be told to eat rice, things like that. So food security itself is a very complicated issue. And in what I have studied is just the first part. And that also very basic part of the first part, which is the production, not even in the store. How much crops we harvest, how many calories we get, and it is connected with poverty, as I said before. So suppose if you calculated how many folks are going to be in a country in 2030, how many of them, because of population growth, and how many of them are likely to be food insecure, and whether the country has the capacity to harvest enough crops to be used as food, irrespective of whatever it was meant to be harvested initially, whether export or not, it doesn't matter. All of the calories versus all the demand growth. And what do we see? Most of sub-Saharan Africa will not have enough calories being harvested to support their extra growth in population and also the folks who are food insecure. Most of the other parts of the world are going to be able to rejig their system a little bit, and they will be all just fine, I think. And those who are not going to be able to harvest enough, like Saudi Arabia, they will sell petroleum and they will earn the money and they will import it. But I doubt it if sub-Saharan African nations will learn to do it. So approximately 50 countries of the world are not going to be able to meet their United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2 target. We are roughly at the halfway point. Those goals were agreed in 2015. We are in 2022, we have 2030, we have 8 more years. And things are not looking very good at this point for these countries. So I will just end over here and thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Ray. Let's all give a round of applause for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So we'll open the floor to questions. So anybody who has a question, feel free to unmute and ask or drop it in the chat.
There's a question, isn't some or most of the processed food eaten though? And so are the exports. Yeah, right. So this question has been asked by every single person, all reporters, all colleagues, everybody. And yeah, it's true. So as I was saying, like a lot of the crops which are harvested to be used as feed or processed and then used as feed do come back, but the efficiency of that system is very low. So most of the calories is lost. A next step, a follow-on step, a more comprehensive analysis is required to do the full loop. So the reason why I did the analysis of this, why we harvest crop, is because for a long time, I was bothered by like, people talk about all these yield gaps. Sub-Saharan African countries and Iowa yields are like this huge yield gap. But that yield gap is not a yield gap really. It is just like the use, why you are harvesting the crop. So I wanted to establish that benchmark kind of a map. The next step is to do the full cycle of calorie analysis. You harvested the crop and then you split it into, like, so when you do the industrial one, a portion of the calories goes away in ethanol. The other one goes off into DDGS. So now you get some calories, but mostly just protein. That protein then goes into the animal feed. And then there is some loss in that process also. And then finally you get the beef. So what is that full cycle? That's a very involved process. And you can imagine how involved it could be if you think about exports. So for example, Australia exports a lot of wheat to, say, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia processes the wheat into flour. And then what does it do? It does not consume all the flour. It then re-exports it to all its neighboring countries, Qatar or maybe Bahrain or some other country. So this is a very complicated thing. And we have to take the next step to do that. So I just wanted to kick off the process and help us start to think about agriculture for what it really is. Agriculture is not, so one of the more interesting, funny things is like people talk about like the US Midwest as the bread basket. Is it really a bread basket? Think about that. It's not a bread basket. It's an ethanol basket now. So it's, anyway.
And so we've got another question. How does organic farming play a role within SDG 2?
Organic farming is just like 1 or 2% of the world at this point. So it's a very tricky business. Organic farming requires that you will not use any extra nitrogen from outside. So you cannot input that. And nitrogen, as a synthetic nitrogen, has been key to increasing crop productivity. So once you pull it out of the system, now what will happen to your crop yields? So people may think that your crop yields will do well with just like, because you are doing more cover cropping or something, you will just stick it, it will still have the same productivity. But I think there will be a huge productivity crash. And you cannot sustain the world with organic farming at this point, at this current point in time. We cannot sustain the world with organic farming. And so in any case, it's a very small number, just 1 or 2%.
I have a question. I have a question for you. I thought those maps at the very beginning were just really, really interesting. And just kind of two parts. So you talked about, or you showed the color in terms of stagnated. Is there things that we can do to improve that in terms of technology? And the second part, in terms of looking at those areas where the yield is really, really up there and increasing, is that new land that's being kind of deforested, or new land that they're using?
Yeah. So the stagnation part, what did you wanted to ask about the stagnation part?
In terms of there's things that we can do to improve that land, or it's just like it's really kind of the result of soil erosion, and there really isn't anything that can be done with it because of just the loss of kind of the topsoil.
So the yield part actually is a sum total of many, many individual effects, the partial effects. So it's very complicated, and there are two parts to this. One part is what you're talking is true, the soil quality depletion and the huge increase in degraded lands around the world. So that is one part. The other part is the socio-economic part. And farmers cannot always manage to, acquire the seed, the fertilizer, the irrigation, any other technology, pesticides, of different kinds of pesticides to boost their crop productivity. So that's one thing. There is another aspect to this socioeconomic things. In some places, you cannot use this high yielding seeds. So in the United States is harvesting that yellow corn, I don't know, yellow corn something, I forgot, there's a particular name version of the yellow corn, which is harvested. That is not really human grade. We cannot really eat that yellow corn. So the corn which is grown in, say, Mexico, it's very interesting how it performs, how it works in the system. So in Mexico, when they want to make the tortilla, they don't want to use the yellow corn. So they harvest the corn, whichever corn, which is a land race going back generations, like maybe hundreds of years. And it has a unique taste or whatever it has. So that one, they are interested not necessarily to boost their productivity of that corn, but they want to get that corn in a certain, stable fashion. So they import the yellow corn from the US that is used as animal feed, and that is used as, then for meat production. But for the tortilla, they harvest it. The same thing happens in many parts of the world. So the Chinese people, when they want to make the tofu, they probably use the soybean, which is harvested in China. Whereas the soybean from Brazil is for animal feed.
Interesting.
Or it's processed and then sent as, in the units and then sent as animal feed. So, so that's
like you said, complicated.
Yeah. So the socio-economic thing is a very big deal. Like why it doesn't increase the yields. Part of the reason is no money, no technology, but part of the reason is on purpose, not to increase it, because they believe in that taste and they cannot boost it because of, again, in a circle, going back in circles, like no, research and no investigation to improve its yield. But in the Midwest, we have invested a lot. Lots of money has been invested to boost corn yields. So corn yields are huge.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. I was wondering if you could reflect on the environmental sustainability a little bit, because you talked about the need to increase crop productivity and intensify agriculture. And so I wanted to see what you thought about our ability to improve efficiency with which resources are used versus realizing absolute reductions in resource use.
So for efficiency, here is a number. We're working on some work more recently. 20 or 30 years ago, approximately, I think 14% of the world's fertilizer, nitrogenous fertilizer, went into corn production. And now that number has become 18%. So amount of fertilizer applied in the United States and the return, like how many kilograms you get from a kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer application is, I think, around like 35. So for every kilogram of nitrogen applied, you get back 35 kilograms of corn production. Whereas in Brazil or even in China, China is like as bad as the United States actually in terms of this efficiency part. And in Ethiopia or something like that, the ratio is like 300 or something like that, because they are not even applying any fertilizer, very little bit, and whatever fertilizer you apply, you use it. So the issue is efficient, applying the right amount, but that right amount is never taking place. People are applying less in some parts, people are applying more in other parts, resulting in all this pollution, nitrous oxide emissions, ammonia emissions, methane emissions also. So that's one aspect of the environment, and water pollution, and then excess application in the Midwest, and then the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's one aspect of it. The other one is we have to keep increasing the yield. And I did a calculation, and I published this in this paper in 2013, like the required rates of increasing crop yields, if you want to double production from 2005 or so, you need to be on a, say, 2.4% increase in crop productivity in the top 4 crops. Maize was almost there, but rice and wheat were below 1%, just a 1% increase in crop productivity. Suppose, just for hypothetical reasoning, we need to double wheat and rice production. I think we don't need it, but suppose we needed it. Just to increase that wheat, double the wheat between 2005 or so and 2050, because of the low increases in productivity, you will need a land which is the size of 2/3 of Texas, or equal to the size of the land of New South Wales, just one crop for wheat. And that amount of land is not present anywhere in the world. So it's like, to come back to your question, Kyle, like you have to increase in yield. How serious is this matter? It is the size of a Texas. That is how serious that matter is for not improving the yield. So that will wipe out the whole of the Amazon or so, roughly. If we do not succeed in boosting the yields further, yields are increasing. If we don't boost it further, this is what is going to happen. The whole Amazon will go away because the world population is not going to stop. It's still growing, and nobody can stop the growth of the middle class, and nobody should, because everybody has a right. And then it brings back to the first graphs I showed you. Everybody is looking at American diet, and everybody aspires to it. And all immigrants, I can tell you, I came to the United States from India. I don't eat so much meat, but I can tell you all immigrants immediately start to eat 63 kgs of chicken per year from like 6 kgs of chicken per year. Like when they were back in India or some other place. You can ask some of your folks over here if they did that or not. But I guarantee you more or less everybody did that.
Thanks. I have one more question, but
that's the challenge.
yeah. I have one more question.
It's a very tricky thing. And when I do the research, I myself go round and round in circles. It's like, study this, but you solve this, but then what about that? And it's like this becomes that, and that it needs a full teamwork. Everybody has to.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for your thoughts on that. I have one more question, but I wanted to see if anybody else in attendance has questions before I pose it. Okay, so this will probably be the last question. Then we'll ask any non-grad student participants to sign off so that the grad students can interact with Dr. Ray. And so I know that you're focused mostly on crop production, but I also wanted to ask a little bit about what you think about sustainable diets, like the Eat Lancet diet or the Planetary Health diet, and whether you think trying to modify crop production patterns and amounts to meet that those sustainable dietary targets is advisable. Yeah, I wanted to see what you thought.
Yeah, so a group of activists from India had come like a couple of months back, and I asked them your question. Like, what do you think about the Mediterranean diet, which is like close enough to like the Eat Lancet diet? And their answer was, just eat what you eat and try to eat well. Don't try to eat like polished rice, for example, because it has all the nutrients gone. There is no macronutrients in there. I mean, the micronutrients, not macro. Macro is there. The micronutrients is all gone in there. So that's what their suggestion was. Everybody, and keep your mind open to all types of diet. Don't get fixated on any one particular diet, like this Mediterranean diet. You don't need to do that. People have survived for thousands of years without, I don't know, this thing about this Mediterranean diet and all these things. Not necessary, I think. But with respect to the meat and dairy production aspect, that thing is, the world is already on track for that. And the latest frontier for this rapid ramp up of meat consumption, dairy consumption, is sub-Saharan Africa, as surprising as that might be. It is full, it's a lot of poverty there, very poor countries, but there is a middle class which is growing fast in that area. They're all shifting their diets. So in the next 2 decades or so, this is the place where there is going to be a huge bump in population growth and middle class growth. And consequently, this massive pull towards meat and dairy consumption. I don't know what is going to happen to the remaining forests in these places and natural landscapes. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, very much so. Thank you. So let's all thank Dr. Ray once more for his great talk and for all of the great answers he's provided to us. We can stop the recording now. And for all of those who